Panic mode is setting in. EV sales are below expectations in the UK, and as a result of the UK ZEV mandate, there are some massive fines likely to be imposed. Alternatively, there'll be a load of wheeling and dealing, and those who exceed their targets will be offering credits to those who don't, the offenders. We also include news of the latest November updates just released with EV sales. Well, several EV manufacturers must be rubbing their hands in glee. For them, it's Christmas. I'm Dave. This is Dave Takes It On. Well, we're going to name and shame, and while there are plenty of surprises in store, there are also the usual suspects. But we need to open with, what is it all about? Well, this and previous governments set legal obligations requiring the UK to meet specific net zero CO2 and pollution targets. I quote, these will require the rapid decarbonisation of the UK economy, requiring a 68% reduction in greenhouse gas by 2030 and a 78% reduction by 2035. Transport is the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector, and cars and vans make up 2/3 of all transport emissions. So basically, politicians from both major parties, with much more knowledge on the subject than you or I have, believe we need to do this. So short of a shock general election in the next few days, and the subsequent election of a new party that does not believe in net zero, we're heading to net zero. Get used to it. It's a done deal. Vehicle emissions include particulate matter, PM, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, benzene, various hydrocarbons like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, trace metals, and non-metals like lead, sulfur. Hydrocarbons and trace elements are usually grouped together and known as mobile source air toxics. It's only in recent years that the ability to monitor all of this and measure their effect on the human body and on the climate in relation to global warming that we've begun to take direct action. The word toxic alone here should be a clue as to why we need to do something, why we must do something. Well, the motor industry has repeatedly failed to voluntarily reduce the fuel consumption of the cars they make and the emissions and pollutants they produce. So governments, different parties, have over the years been forced to bring in legislation. Cars are already mandated to reduce the amount of fuel they burn and reduce the emissions they produce. But instead of supporting such moves as beneficial to society, the legacy auto industry responded by producing bigger and bigger cars, meaning that emissions and pollution have barely reduced. One of the best sellers at the moment for use in London is a Range Rover with a V8 petrol engine that does about 15 miles to the gallon round town. If cars had followed the trajectory of personal computers, PCs, then today's cars would be doing about 1,000 miles per gallon, be virtually clean and green, and cost a few £1,000s to buy. Sadly, none of that is even remotely true. So we reach today and the ZEV, or the Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate. Well, sorry about all the terminology. Just to recap, ZEV is Zero Emission Vehicle. That means it's a vehicle that produces no emissions as it drives. EV is an electric vehicle, and within that category we have BEV, which is battery electric vehicle or 100% electric, as opposed to the hybrid electric vehicle, HEV, or a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, PHEV, both of which have a fossil fuel engine as well as a battery and electric motor. Well, the government recognised that we cannot change overnight, so they set in motion a plan, this was Conservatives, to achieve this goal by 2035. It set increasingly more difficult to achieve targets for the reduction of new ICE car sales, which are the ones that cause the emissions, and increasingly more difficult to reach targets for the increased sales of new BEVs, which produce zero emissions from the exhaust pipes They don't have exhaust pipes, so by definition, they produce no emissions. Hybrids of all sorts are being phased out as they still produce emissions. In reality, most are far more ICE than EV. Once again, instead of embracing this transition, which will be hugely beneficial to the population and a tremendous opportunity for employment to all, some in both motor industry and the oil giant industry set about various campaigns to ridicule and hopefully destroy altogether the transition to ZEVs. Many seem to have firmly believed that, well, governments around the world would just capitulate and allow them to carry on as before. Others chose the opposite route, commenced the transition willingly as an opportunity, and now only produce ZEVs. Most legacy autos are somewhere in between. Well, the data varies daily. There's good months and bad months. November was a spectacularly good month for EVs. But for the first half of the year, the first auto manufacturer to have already reached and easily surpassed the target of 22% of EVs sold in the UK in 2024 for the whole year is a total surprise. It's Geely, with 36% and climbing. Well, this, as you may know, is a Chinese company, but they have already exceeded the UK mandate and they're very likely to hold that position way past the end of the year deadline. Geely owns, amongst others, Volvo, Polestar, Lotus, Smart, and Proton brands. Geely now manufactures more than 36% of its cars for the UK market as zero-emission vehicles. So fact number one, the mandate target is not impossible to reach, clearly. Number two, it's another Chinese company, SAIC, which makes the MG4 and MG ZS EVs. They have already achieved 23.6% of their target, and they are likely, not certain, to maintain that throughout the whole of the year. And before anyone says this is just Chinese companies that are paid by the governments to make and sell it, all the usual rubbish, the next manufacturer will shock you. It's BMW. Not Chinese. Well, BMW in the first half of the year are on more than 26% of their sales being EVs. It's looking pretty certain they will still be in excess of 22% at the end of the year. I told you that would shock you. Not a Chinese company, not funded by the Chinese government. This is a good, solid German company that's been around for over 100 years and is a major quality manufacturer of both ICE and EVs. Now, this is not a guarantee that they will still be in excess of 22% by the end of the year. If they had a massive spike in ICE sales in the last quarter, they could still fall short, but it's actually looking very unlikely. So this raises an important question. If BMW can achieve this target, why can't others? Take Suzuki, for example. They make budget EVs. They sell very well in the UK. But to date, they've not made a single EV. 0%. Why not? Well, at this stage, I do need to explain that the mandate is not a hard and fast hit 22% or get heavily penalised. That would be brutal. Instead, it has multiple levels. First, there is what's called a compliance level. You've got to hit this one. This is set at 6% of your cars as EVs, not 22%. So should be really easy target for most to reach, not Suzuki. Above this level, you're allowed certain benefits. For example, if you're short of your EV target this year, but you can show that you're likely to reach or exceed it next year, you can count some of them future sales. Or if you're part of a larger group like Stellantis or VW, you can count some of the EV sales from other members who've exceeded their targets within the same group. Likewise, if you exceed your limit this year, you can bank that as a credit for future years when the EV percentage increases. 2025 is going to raise to 28%, 2027 it'll be 38%, and so on. Well, instead, they may wish to buy credits from companies like Geely who are way over the minimum limit. You may have noticed I've not mentioned Tesla. They sell 100% EVs. They don't do anything else. They're not in any calculation at all. They just breeze through. BYD, likewise, is on a trajectory that it's probably going to reach 100% EVs in the future. Well, these companies stand to make a huge profit from selling their credits. Well, back to Suzuki. They're not part of a group, so they're likely to have to borrow or buy credits on the open market. Okay, before we hit you with the bad boys, the next shock will be Mercedes. Yeah, another manufacturer of ICE cars, And EVs, another German company, and another that's been around almost as long, about 98 years. So once again, why Mercedes? Well, the answer is they embraced the challenge and the opportunity that the ZEV mandate brought and set about making decent, if expensive, EVs in sufficient numbers to make a difference. The first mass market EV, the EQC, launched back in 2016. They were quite an early player. Ford, on the other hand, fought tooth and nails to not only not make EVs, but to actively try to stop their adoption by anybody. Effectively, they hyped up their ICE offerings and they hyped up the shortcomings of their early EV, the Mach-E. Dealers everywhere in America happily steered their buyers towards the ICE models, which were highly profitable at the time, and brutally steered buyers away from their EVs, which were a massive loss maker, still are. Well, sadly for them, this has now seriously backfired because they are only now beginning to find out that their previous efforts were actually very, very effective. Their customers today who desperately want to buy their latest EVs are still convinced by them that they're rubbish, too expensive, no range, no infrastructure, huge depreciation. They're reaping today the bitter rewards of their own efforts. Now they are required to sell a certain percentage of EVs. They cannot find the customer. They've been convinced that EVs are not for them. They're not at all keen to believe that suddenly Ford is making brilliant EVs, which are way better in every way than their ICE offerings, which of course they aren't. Ford's first EV release was really late 2020 with the Mach-E and early 2022 with the F-150 Lightning. Anybody would think they didn't really want to sell any. We're really late to the market, and that explains why Ford is one of the very few companies that has barely reached the 6% compliance limit, and in fact may not even be able to hold on to that. They're already talking about stopping ICE car sales altogether in the UK to make their EV figures look relatively better. It is that desperate. Toyota is also another. It's in an impossibly low position and highly unlikely to get to the 22%. But they're more than twice better what Ford are achieving. Toyota has also avoided making EVs, fearing their ICE business, which traditionally has made them the greatest profits, will suffer if they do. Renault also look very unlikely to reach target and are not part of any group from which they could borrow credits. Hyundai will struggle, but they might get there. Mazda, little chance. Honda could be okay. Aston Martin, 0%. They have no EVs for sale at present, so they're going to find it impossible to get there on their own results. Nissan, probably about halfway. This does raise several interesting questions. Why did some major manufacturers see EVs as a way forward and set off on the path, while others rejected them wholeheartedly and continued on their own way regardless? Target was by no means impossible. Several companies are already there, others are within easy striking distance, some further away. And many of those that aren't yet above the target 22% are within a sensible distance of being able to buy credits that they can afford at a sensible level to avoid any fines at all. Volkswagen just looks to be in serious trouble. The group as a whole cannot offer any other members enough credits at a sensible price because none of them are doing well. And they're so far away, it's difficult to see what they can do. If they had a relatively low sales target like Mazda, they can work wonders in the last month or so. But when they sell so many cars, it's really difficult to change the trend. That is why a number of legacy auto are already petitioning the government to ease the mandate, lower the limit, give them a waiver. But one has to ask realistically what a pause or a waiver would achieve for the likes of Ford. For some, they are so far away that only a total scrapping of the limits would have any real impact at all. Stellantis recently announced its closing the Vauxhall factory at Ellesmere Port, and they blame the collapse of the EV market. And that's a collapse that mainly affects those legacy makers that don't want EVs and are making minimum effort. But the truth is very different. Closing the Ellesmere factory, that was always been on the cards. It's been closing for several decades now. But that's not going to stop Vauxhall cars being made. In Europe, they are virtually identical. They're just called Opel. So expect to see a rush of brand new Opel cars arriving on our shores. Well, the UK factory might be dead, but the sales are not, just rebadged. Now, we don't know what the UK government is going to do. They've already said that they're going to look into it, but that anything they do will not affect the banning of the sale of new ICE cars that will commence now, brought forward to 2030. For manufacturers who do not reach the target and cannot buy enough credits, they face a fine of around £15,000 per car over the limit. And for many manufacturers, that is thousands of cars. Waiving the limit altogether this year will only force the limit to be raised much higher next year. And there is precious little sign that Ford EV sales next year will be any better. The recent efforts have been pitiful, pathetic. Little more than buying in other EV products, making a few cosmetic changes, rebadging them. I'm talking about the Capri and the Explorer. They then hike up the price even higher to try to maintain a high profit margin, thereby practically forcing people to choose the cheaper alternatives. Even the next model, destined for the UK, the Puma, recently announced. Now, the Puma is one of the best-selling cars in the UK as a petrol car. They're going back to using the ICE shell from the Puma and components and then stuffing in all the electric bits and pieces. It's not likely to be a really attractive EV purpose-built. It's not going to be attractive to buy, and the suggested price is likely to be around £10,000 dearer than the identical petrol version, 10 to 15,000 dearer than their competitors, the Chinese EVs. You see, America might have no Chinese competition over there, but we welcome Chinese imports. They're selling good, quality and cheap. Ford will not sell their cars against them in the near future. There is still time to correct matters. First, the government could waive this year's target, giving them a breathing space, but that in itself is highly dangerous because BMW and Mercedes will scream that they've made the effort themselves, they've taken the pain, they've reached the target. They will bitterly oppose that move. Well, mainly because they now have massive competitive edge over those who have failed to hit the 22%. They must be loving that. Or they could just stop selling all cars in the UK altogether. Just pack it in right off the UK market. This is a UK only target. Other countries have their own targets or strategies. If anyone stops selling new cars altogether, they'll face no fines, need no credits. But they would then need to find new markets to make up the loss of sales. And that new market is shrinking rapidly. Or legacy might just have a fire sale. That is what's happening right now. With November figures just released, there is a massive sell-off going on. November alone saw around 25% of all new car sales were EVs. So there is a massive movement. But I'm not going to go into too much detail about November because for many, this will still be not enough to get them to the target. Overall, despite the 25% EV percentage in November, the outlook is still that it will only be about 19 or 20% for the whole year. Most will miss it. This is always the danger of reading too much into a single headline news item. The mandate covers sales, not profits. Most in November did exactly this, but they cannot do it forever. They drastically slashed their prices. Ford, VW, and many others could simply flog off more at really silly low prices in December to reach compliance. Register as demo cars, service vehicles, demo, whatever it is, pre-registered to be sold off cheap in a few months' time. See, that could work out much cheaper than buying the credit or paying the fines or packing it in altogether. But it's not a long-term plan. Even if it worked this year, cannot be repeated year after year. Ford already lose about $40,000 on each EV sale on every EV in America. They only have a certain amount of money to play around with. Or, well, I'm not sure there really is another or. other than the just go bust and pack it all in. Panic mode is really setting in, and most are now realizing that if they had previously taken it even slightly seriously and made a real effort and got some passable results, they might today have a chance of surviving. Those that didn't probably don't. For my viewers, you might just want to get your savings cashed in, credit cards at the ready, because there might be some incredible bargains to be had in the coming final weeks of this year. If you thought you've already seen some good EV deals, you probably ain't seen nothing yet. It is not too late, but it is very late. Many can still realistically get to that target, but it'll take a lot. Some will be able to lie and cheat the way this year by shifting all their sales projected they're going to get next year back to this year. Others will get close enough to be able to afford to buy enough credits to get there anyhow. Others won't. And many who lie and cheat their way through this year will find, well, next year they've already used up all those sales once. It's going to become even more impossible with a higher limit. Well, for the buying public, it will have less effect. As long as we, in the UK, can buy EVs at a sensible price, we are much less worried about who makes them. Well, how can I say that? Well, because it's Christmas and most of the decorations, almost all the Christmas lights and most of the toys we buy our kids and grandkids, they're all made in China. You know it. As are the batteries we put in the kids' toys. I'm Dave. If you have enjoyed this, please click the like button. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Subscriptions really matter to us. They're a really big help. They tell YouTube that people want to watch more of our videos, so YouTube kindly obliges and shows them to more people around the world. So thanks very much. I'm Dave.